Hello and welcome to The View from 22, a show from Spectator TV where we go a little bit deeper into your story of the day. I'm Cindy Yu, The Spectator's assistant editor. Over the weekend, there were incredible scenes in Russia as Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner mercenary group, launched almost a coup on the Kremlin. This invited comparisons to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, but it was over within 24 hours. Prigozhin is now allegedly being exiled to Belarus, although no one has really seen him since Saturday night. And the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that this will not be the final act in this play. So, what's going to be happening from here, and what do we make of the weekend's events anyway? Joining me to discuss is Professor Mark Galeotti, who's a Russia and security analyst and a contributor to The Spectator, as well as Svitlana Morenets, author of The Spectator's weekly Ukraine newsletter. So, Mark and Svitlana, welcome to The View from 22. Mark, to start with, can you update viewers on the situation as it is on Monday?
Well, it's an odd situation in that on one level everything's changed, on one level not much. We've had the Wagner forces stand down, leave Rostov-on-Don and Voronezh, head back to bases probably in Lugansk region. Prigozhin himself has not, so far at least, popped up in Minsk as we were told was going to happen. He left with his guys to considerable acclaim from Rostov-on-Don. And from the point of view of the Russian state media, they're more or less saying, that's it, everything is over. And quite symbolically, they have sort of stories about street cleaners busy sort of sweeping the streets in Rostov to bring everything back to normal. But so long as Prigozhin is still somewhere out there and we don't know what, there is always a kind of a wild card risk. So in a way, we're all waiting to see what happens next.
And this morning we've also seen that Sergey Shoigu, the Russian defense secretary, has also surfaced. Some people had been saying over the weekend that perhaps Prigozhin agreed to stand down if Shoigu, his enemy as it were, was fired. So what do we make of that, Mark?
Well, the suggestion is that in fact this is footage from an earlier trip, possibly Friday, that Shoigu did. It's worth noting that nowadays one almost feels that actually for these footages to be credible, almost like a terrorist proof of life video, they should be holding up a copy of today's newspaper. The main point about that is not about whether or not Shoigu did or did not go to the front. It's that by showing this is symbolic. This is the Kremlin basically saying that Shoigu is still our man, no deals were struck. And in many ways, actually, I think Prigozhin has, at least for the moment, saved Shoigu, his number one enemy, precisely because I think Putin is aware that at the moment he anyway looks weak about the deal he struck with Prigozhin. Having denounced him as a traitor, he's then basically said, well, we'll drop all the charges as long as you go to Belarus. If he also actually abandoned his defense minister, even if he had good other reasons to be doing so, again, that would look like a concession to Prigozhin. So I think for the moment we can assume that both Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov are safe. And it's probably something that, for example, Kiev would be relatively happy about.
Well, Svitlana, let's talk about Kiev. Presumably, the Ukrainians would have wanted the situation to last longer, and nobody quite thought that it would be over quite so soon.
Yes, everybody was a bit disappointed that so-called rebellion lasted less than 24 hours. And of course, if Russian authorities would be fighting with Prigozhin, it would be beneficial for Ukraine, so it could continue with its counteroffensive. But we have what we have, and there are rumors that Prigozhin will be sent to Minsk with Wagner fighters for actually attacking Kiev. But Ukrainian commanders say that it will be a suicide because for the last more than a year of the full-scale war, part of Ukrainian troops were building defensive lines in the Kiev region, in the border between Ukraine and Belarus. So it will be much more difficult for them to try to attack from Belarus again because Ukraine right now is much more prepared than it was 1 year ago.
And do we know anything about how Ukraine has taken advantage of the coup, short as it was? Was there any movement on the counteroffensive?
There was in Donetsk region, Ukrainian army has been advancing near Bakhmut, like north of Bakhmut, south of Bakhmut. And as far as I know, they retook like 16 square kilometers. It is Still not a lot comparing like to the success that the Ukrainian army had last year in Kherson and Kharkiv regions. But Russians are well prepared this time. So also there were a lot of reports of our army using like Storm Shadow missiles and artillery, everything they can, for shelling the military warehouse in occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, and also in occupied part of Zaporizhia region. And Ukrainian command talks that it is only a preparation stage and it is still not like the main stage of the counteroffensive.
Mark, what was Prigozhin thinking? I mean, I am now starting to talk about this in the past tense because it does look like this, at least, episode is over for now. But what could he possibly have been thinking? I mean, he's been criticizing the Kremlin and the Russian army for months now, but to actually think that he could carry out a coup, or did he not actually think that he could go through with the whole thing? I mean, what do you think he was planning on?
Yeah, I don't think for a minute that this was an attempt to seize power, not least because, when it came down to it, he had actually close to Moscow no more than, say, 4,000 troops. I think it's questionable whether he could have got into Moscow, let alone seize the city, and then what? No, I mean, I think more than anything else, look, we don't know, so the following is speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if Prigozhin had heard precisely that he was going to be arrested or otherwise taken down. He had made, after all, a lot of enemies, not just Defence Minister Shoigu. And so he decided to strike first. And to strike first, not in a way to try and actually sort of topple the government, because after all, he's the beneficiary of this government, but rather to essentially try and show his hands, show his strength, and force the government to make concessions. And in that respect, I think he must have been hoping for two things that didn't happen. First was mass defections from the regular military. As it was, a lot of soldiers were not willing to stop Wagner, but nor were they willing to join. But the second thing, he was precisely hoping that Putin would leave the door open to negotiations. When Putin made a very, very intemperate address describing what Prigozhin was doing as a stab in the back, as treason and so forth, then I think it became clear to Prigozhin that there was no sort of middle way. There was no way he was going to be able to topple the government. There was no way he could simply walk away from this. So there had to be some kind of negotiations. So I think it's really, a man who, anyway, we know has relatively poor impulse control, but also found himself in a position in which, it was his neck. And arguably, I mean, on one level, although he suffered a serious blow, Putin sort of won in the immediate moment in that he diffused this challenge. But in some ways, potentially, Prigozhin has won something too. If he was about to be arrested or otherwise taken down, well, maybe in those circumstances, better to be a millionaire in Minsk than just another convict in a Russian labour camp.
But presumably the target on his back will now be much, much larger than it was before the weekend. I mean, as we've talked about already, he hasn't been seen since Saturday night. If he is seen in Belarus, in Minsk, if I were him, I would still very much watch my back.
Yes, indeed. I mean, look, we know that one of the things that are absolute hot-button issues for Putin are those people he considers traitors. I mean, after all, he was willing to risk his diplomatic relationship with Britain in order to go after Litvinenko and Skripal. So I don't think he'd have a problem with seeing something done to Prigozhin. But on the other hand, there probably will need to be some kind of period of sort of letting things calm down. If Prigozhin dies tomorrow, it's precisely the kind of thing that makes him in some ways perversely, for the fact that he is a thuggish opportunist, nonetheless a martyr to the ordinary regular Russian soldiers dying for those fat cats in the Kremlin. So I think they'll probably let it lie for a while. But absolutely, I mean, I would not be basically offering Prigozhin any life insurance anytime soon.
Yeah, not taking any bottles of water from strangers or not having a taster for your meals. Svitlana, let's talk about Belarus's role in all of this, because it was Lukashenko, Belarus's leader, who brokered this deal. And you've written on the weekend for Spectator's Coffee House about how the Belarusian opposition leader is taking advantage of this. How do you see that country's role in all of this?
Of course, Lukashenko is trying to show to Putin that he still can be useful for him. And as Putin didn't want to negotiate directly with Prigozhin, so Lukashenko made it for him. And at that time, Svitlana Tikhanovskaya, she is the opposition leader in exile. She was calling for Belarusian army to rise against Lukashenko, his regime, and against Russia, the same as some members of her opposition who previously were in the command of the Belarusian army, they still have soldiers there who believe in free Belarus without Russia. But it is unlikely that there will be a revolution or big protests as it happened in 2020, because currently like a big part of Russian army is in Belarus. So if there is like to be any protest, it will be stopped very fast.
Mm-hmm. And the Ukrainian army is not seen as a ploy that Belarus could be even more involved in the war?
No, they are constantly monitoring the situation in the border, and for the last days they have been updating that they don't see any movement, anything, so it's unlikely that that will happen. Also, I would like to add that Prigozhin has been constantly talking that the war against Ukraine cannot be won with the current command that is in Russia, but he never actually mentioned Putin. He always talked like about the Russian defense minister or the commanders, but never about Putin. But also the media close to the Wagner group, they were publishing the ratings of Prigozhin and Putin, and like that Prigozhin was like second after Putin in Russia by popularity. And of course Russian sociology shouldn't be trusted, but if those numbers go into media, that shows that Prigozhin does have some political ambitions. But after the rebellion that he tried to make, I'm not sure for how long he will survive, or even if he could become a potential leader in the future of Russia. Right now it is much more difficult for him.
And Mark, you've written as well that this episode may be over, but it's the beginning of the end for Putin. How do you see this playing out in terms of the threat to his authority from this point onwards?
I mean, look, I don't think there will be lengthy repercussions directly from this. Okay, I mean, we shall wait and see if Prigozhin agrees and whether he wants to start making more trouble. I imagine he won't. If nothing else, because he doesn't want to jeopardise his access to his business empire, his money and such like. But instead, what this really represents is the first time we've actually had a proper check on what is the mood of the Russian security apparatus. You know, there are basically three pillars to Putin's system: his own personal legitimacy, the money that he can throw at any problems that arise, and his control over the security apparatus as the sort of final backstop. Well, his legitimacy is clearly declining, not least because of this catastrophic war. As a result of this war, the money is much less sort of available, and therefore the opportunity to buy your way out of trouble is more limited. And as regards that final element, the control over the security apparatus, I mean, as I say, it was really very striking the degree to which not just the regular military, but also the National Guard forces, and the National Guard are meant to be the sort of the internal security force that keeps control of the streets. When push came to shove, they basically preferred to sit it out. They certainly didn't feel the kind of loyalty to Putin that meant that they interposed themselves to the fast-moving Wagner columns. It doesn't mean to say that the entire military wouldn't have fought if it was a foreign invasion, or that in fact they're all ready to support any kind of challenger to Putin, but it does mean that he can no longer count on their support. And I think this will be crucial, because what we're seeing is a hollowing out of the state. It still looks impressive, but in fact it's much, much less substantial than it was before. And then, well, what's going to be the next black swan event? You know, this was unexpected, and this has been dealt with, but at a cost, leaving the regime even weaker for whatever the next crisis that emerges. And one thing we can say in politics is there will always be a next crisis, whatever that may be.
And Mark, I also wanted to pick your brain on the Chinese role in all of this, because China has been Russia's biggest ally throughout the war, even though, well, just through not opposing the Russian invasion. Over the weekend, the Chinese side have come out to say that this is an internal Russian matter, which is something that they say for things happening within their own borders as well. But it was curious that that statement didn't come out until after the coup had been stopped, and other commentariat within China have said that this has been damaging for for Putin's authority. So if China starts to doubt Putin's authority, you know, I would be very worried if I were him right now.
Look, the bottom line about China's role is they've never really been allies of Putin, so much as they have seen advantage in certain sort of common positions. And they've been perfectly happy to support Putin rhetorically, but at the same time, President Xi read Putin the Riot Act about the nuclear taboo and not being sort of so foolish as to use tactical nuclear weapons, had no qualms with doing that. We have seen a willingness to send dual-use technologies, particularly through third-party sort of import-exporters in Central Asia and Turkey and the like, but we haven't seen a willingness to do anything that really would court sanctions, like sending actual military kit. And the Chinese banking system is very much trying to disentangle itself from the Russian one. So, these are not the signs of a full-throated ally at the best of times. It's more that I think what this means is precisely that Putin is in an even weaker position in terms of his negotiations with the Chinese. He was already in a pretty weak one. But given that it may well be that the Chinese will end up emerging as the main brokers of any kind of peace whenever that actually happens, because tough medicine is something that Putin is more likely to be able to swallow if it's presented by Beijing than if it looks as if it's being imposed by the West. Well, in those circumstances, again, the Chinese will have all the fewer reasons to spend any political capital on Russia and on Putin, and will just be looking at what their own interests are. So this will certainly have done Putin no good, but again, I don't think it's going to lead to a specific change in Chinese policy, because in some ways it's quite handy for them to have Russia chewing away at the West. From their point of view, if Russia wins, it leaves the West in likely disarray, and if Russia loses, well, frankly, the country will just spiral closer into China's orbit. There's a degree to which they don't really have to care quite how this goes.
Very interesting. And Svitlana, just to finish up then, where does all of this leave the Wagner Group and by extension the war effort? Because the Wagner Group have been one of the most successful parts of the Russian effort, you would say probably over the last year and a half. We've been talking about how it might now be disbanded. Putin's offered Wagner soldiers who weren't involved on the weekend army contracts. Is this the end for the Wagner Group? And if so, does that mean Ukraine has a fighting chance again?
I wouldn't say that it is the end for the Wagner Group, because a lot of its fighters are currently joining the regular Russian army. So some of them stay on Prigozhin's side, some of them are taking Putin's side. But of course, it won't be the same. The seizure of Bakhmut, even it wasn't complete, but it was all thanks to the Wagner Group. And they were very cruel, and Prigozhin didn't spare the life of his soldiers. But anyway, they were much more successful and trained, and I would say even equipped than the regular Russian army. So we will see how it goes. Right now, Ukraine doesn't give any predictions, and they just try to see how it goes and just continue with their plans of the counteroffensive, because some expected that, seeing what is happening in Kremlin, that Prigozhin is approaching Moscow, that some of the Russian defense lines will be broken, some of the soldiers will run away, but that didn't happen. And I would say that crucial, what is the difference now in the Russian army than it was before, that currently now they have motivation to fight. And the soldiers who I spoke to say that it's something changed. They want to fight, and they even, when Ukrainian army is advancing, they don't want to be prisoners of war. They just made suicide, because probably they've been told that if they surrender to Ukrainian army, then they will be tortured as Ukrainian prisoners of war, tortured by the Russian army. So we will see how it goes.
And Mark, what do you think? Where does this leave the Wagner Group and the war effort?
I think we've got to sort of unpick this Wagner Group in Russia and Ukraine that I absolutely agree with Svitlana. I think its days are over. It will be picked apart as recruits are sent to different units and such like. There's still going to be Wagner, as it were, on the global stage, though. It's too lucrative a business. If one looks at what's happening in Africa, where Wagner is part of a kind of wider sort of business model, shall we say, in which it provides authoritarian regime support services, along with political technologists to rig elections and send propaganda on social media and such like. So whether it's Prigozhin running it or someone else, we will still see, I think, Wagner on the global stage. In terms of what it means for the actual war, though, it's worth mentioning that Wagner was currently being held in reserve, really reconstituting itself after the meat grinder of the Bakhmut war. That means that it was really going to be used as a reinforcement element. So it was a small, probably more closer to 10,000 than the 25,000 Prigozhin claimed, force that was ready for when the Ukrainians punched through the main defensive lines. Even if its forces are being sent elsewhere, that does mean that one of the most effective elements in the Russian military is not going to be available when the counteroffensive reaches that kind of critical stage. So in the short term, at least, this is an advantage for Kiev.
Mark Galeotti and Svitlana Morenets, thank you so much for joining The View from 22.